There appears to have been a bit of controversy with the new 4K release of Twister, and the clue is perhaps in the cover, because this is somewhat green, whereas we've all become used to how the original poster art did look. Now, there's a new extra within all the extras on this 4K disc. That's a new interview with director Jan De Bont, where he explains there was one sequence where Bill Paxton's character goes out to look at the oncoming clouds and says it's going green, and he could not achieve the green effect with the analog film, but he can now with digital video editing and mastering. Now, I know Twister too well, so this was the first thing I looked at, and I'll show you here a still or two from the Laserdisc and a still or two from the 4K, and you can see on our television there is somewhat more of a green hue to it than how it originally looked. However, home video is never as categoric as the original films, and I saw the film 2 days after its opening at the Empire Leicester Square. Now, this film was made for THX and the 4K in here last night, although there were parts of it I didn't feel were as good because some of the dialogue was muffled on this system. It may not be on everyone's, you sometimes get these sound effects, but I didn't feel it sounded as good in here as the Laserdisc always has, and particularly not as good as it sounded in the Empire in 1996. But it is still possible occasionally to see Twister in a cinema on 35mm film. This is the Courtyard. This was a few months ago, and they actually obtained a 35mm printer screen. I would have liked to have got to see that, but it's quite a long way away, so it wasn't really possible. But this is a good second best to seeing Twister at the Empire all those years ago. I didn't feel it was quite as good as the Empire in here, no surprise there, but sadly that cinema in its form that we saw it in 1996 no longer exists, so this is probably about as close as we're going to get it, unless someone donates a 35mm print to me with all those soundtracks on it. There was Dolby Digital 5.1, there was DTS 5.1, which back then stood for Digital Theatre System. They've changed it to Datasat now, and there was Sony Dynamic Digital Sound. Now, I'm not sure exactly what we saw at the Empire, because there were in fact 70mm blow-ups of Twister. However, by 1996, I believe they all came with DTS TrackSense, so it wouldn't have been 6-track magnetic, so not as impressive as it perhaps could have sounded if we'd have seen it on a 70mm print a few years before. Now, back in those days in the Leicester Square cinemas, there were occasionally giveaways like this, and this mini quad poster was not unusual. We collected quite a few during those years in the mid-90s, but sadly those days seem to have gone, and nowadays if you want something like this, it generally comes in a special edition 4K or Blu-ray release. One other thing I have from Twister is the original soundtrack CD, but this is just pop songs, rock songs, in particular the Van Halen tracks. I think it's Van Halen as the opening track, and then the musical version, Respect the Wind, which plays over the end credits of Twister, is the great theme at the end of this CD, so worth having on that basis alone perhaps. The 4K. It was originally shot anamorphic 35mm. Some of the effects were done VistaVision, so horizontal 8 sprocket across 35mm, and that was to make sure the effects when they were optically composited into the live action looked as seamless as possible, the same process as was applied to the original Star Wars films. But the marriage between practical effects and CGI in this is just about perfect. It's the way it should be done today. But alas, we've still got a way to go to get back to where we were in the 1990s, and most notably with image quality. But in here, it's almost entirely seamless when it goes from one to the other. Now, there are a few things in Twister that you couldn't do at all with practical effects, but if you're wondering how they did that petrol tanker sequence with it exploding on the road in front of the truck as the camera goes towards it, that was actually done with a reproduction of a tanker filled with fuel, and they dropped it from a crane, and that really was a genuine explosion they were going into. So quite a feat. It was an expensive film, but it's all up there on the screen. It had an estimated budget of $92 million. At the worldwide box office, it took $495 million. So this was a fantastic success, and I think the teaser trailer had an awful lot to do with that, because it did entice you to want to go and see the film, and they played it at the Empire several times before the film opened, and we wanted to get there on opening weekend. Fortunately, that trailer was released on Super 8, and so this is how Twister looked on Super 8. It never got a full feature release, not even an extract, but it was still something special to be able to get that trailer that we saw and enjoyed so much at the Empire several times. Now, it doesn't have the green look at all in this trailer, and that's how I prefer to see the film, but I did think that once I was watching Twister, that single sequence where they show the sky going green wouldn't actually bother me, and I found it did actually blend into the rest of the film. On the telly it was too green. In here, and it's something to do I think with the enlargement, and it was Trevor at Double Bill Movies who spoke about this first. He wondered if a telly was somehow compressing colours so that you see a more accentuated hue compared to projecting, which stretches everything out and then it's just not so obvious. And that seemed to be the case with Twister in here at 10 feet wide. It wasn't anywhere near as green as it was on my telly, but I have to admit I didn't go through my telly and start playing with all the settings. I don't tend to watch films on the telly, so it doesn't really bother me so much. But in here, I think I might have been bothered if Twister had have looked this green at any time, but it was what Jan De Bont wanted to do with his 4K release, and who are we to argue with Jan De Bont? It's a fantastic film. It looks great with that anamorphic 35mm, so full frame 35mm quality. Bit of VistaVision thrown in for the special effects. Great colour, great density. It looks like a film. It's just not quite as good as I remembered it at the Empire Leicester Square, but possibly the colour I've got used to on the Laserdisc has clouded my judgment somewhat, but I had a thoroughly great time in here. The sound is fantastic. It always has been on Twister. It's one of those films that surround sound was made for, and particularly THX. If you've got a THX Ultra with a massive subwoofer or two, then I think you're in for a treat with this one. There is one sequence near the beginning where there's a special effect creation, I think it is, of lightning strikes, and just after the lightning the screen is freezed, and you can tell this on this 4K because it's so clear. The film grain goes static. Now some people will think, oh, they've messed up the transfer. It's not that, it's how it was shot, and it was probably a timing thing, and they felt like they needed some black frames after the one lightning strike until it got to the next one, and so they just freeze that frame. Now on a film print it wouldn't be so obvious because you'd have the next generation film with the film grain, doing my David Lynch impression there, the film grain sparkling away and disguising the static film grain of the negative. So it's obvious on here because this is a direct scan of the negative that's then been mastered, and maybe in here I didn't have it black enough, the picture black enough, and so it was obvious. See what you think on that, but that's nothing to be concerned about. It's just early on it's setting the scene for the film. So that's one thing that I would say that I spotted that some people might not be happy with, apart from the greenery part of it. But 1 hour and 53 minutes running time, and it cost £19.99 from HMV and other retailers, I believe. Now, if you like Twister, there are a few other films that are worth looking at. It's not as good, but it's obviously a bit of an influence, or indeed a complete rip-off. Into the Storm. Now, this isn't as good as Twister, nowhere near as good, but I find it a thoroughly good romp, and that one's worth a look. You can generally find this Blu-ray for something like 50p or £1 in CEX, so that one's maybe worth looking into. But one from around the same time, I think this was 96 or 97, Linda Hamilton and Pierce Brosnan in Dante's Peak. Now, if there's one other film I'd like to see on 4K now that Twister is out, it's this one. This is another great NTSC Laserdisc with the original cinema sound on it, and an absolute treat and a great accompaniment to Twister. It's a volcano film, as you probably already know, and it's as explosive and with such good sound as Twister. So people are often asking me, what films would I like to see released on 4K? And I can't think of anything. I say, well, I'd have to go through my Laserdisc collection to work that one out, but that's one of them. Now then, what's next on the Movie Collector channel? I suspect it's going to be Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street. Quite a few people have asked me to take a look at this one. I think it should be good because I did see it at the cinema. Can't remember much about how it looked. I do remember how scary it was to be in the Leicester Square Theatre almost all alone at the 6 o'clock showing on a Monday evening. But I got quite a history with A Nightmare on Elm Street, so all of them actually. I don't know if many people got to see the final film at the cinema, but there's another one I saw at the Leicester Square Theatre, which became known as the Odeon West End later on when they split it up. But that's the NTSC 3D Laserdisc of Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. So anyway, you have to keep watching to see what I think of A Nightmare on Elm Street on 4K. Probably one of the scariest horror films I ever saw in a cinema. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and perhaps consider subscribing so I'll be encouraged to carry on creating content like this. Until the next video, bye bye for now.